right now is Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas. He's a member of the Judiciary, Armed Services, and Intelligence Committees. Good morning to you. I'd like to understand what your problem is and what your contention is in terms of how you think this administration, how the government has handled these rescue plans.
Well, Andrew, I think it's been failures all the way down for Joe Biden and the Biden bank bailout. Take a step back a couple of years. Joe Biden's reckless economic policies created the inflationary environment that put Silicon Valley Bank, so many other banks, at risk. If you didn't have that reckless spending, you didn't have inflation. No inflation, you wouldn't have interest rate hikes. No interest rate hikes, you didn't have banks that were exposed to long duration interest rate risks. But having done that 6 months ago, Joe Biden's regulators obviously should have saw what was happening at Silicon Valley Bank and perhaps other banks and taken action to get them to hedge that risk, maybe selling off assets at the time, not in a fire sale, or doing interest rate hedges. 6 days ago, seeing what was happening, they should have arranged some kind of shotgun wedding merger with a stronger bank with a stronger balance sheet. I don't think they did that because they have ideological opposition to any such merger, and they're all afraid of Elizabeth Warren and her acolytes attacking them, and they'd just rather have state control of these assets rather than private control.
Where do you land, though, on personal responsibility? The personal responsibility of the business leaders at SVB, the business leaders at Signature Bank, and the other banks as well. So much of what the Federal Reserve and, frankly, the administration was doing was relatively telegraphed. It was relatively telegraphed what was in the offing here. Typically, you've talked about personal responsibility before.
Yeah, no, I believe that all those managers had personal responsibilities. I think that the central failure here, in addition to the Biden administration's failures of economic and supervisory actions, was the failure of the managers at these banks, chasing too much yield and putting too much risk on their balance sheet. Now,
right, I think it's a chicken and egg. Do we blame the Fed for easy money and the administration and the previous administrations for flooding the system with money during the pandemic and the like, or do we blame the leaders of these banks for taking advantage of that and in fact taking advantage of it?
Yes. Andrew, you can lay the blame both. It's Joe Biden's reckless spending policies that created the inflationary environments, and the regulators that didn't do enough to forestall this. That's what they're there for, to exercise supervisory function over these managers. The managers shouldn't have taken these risks either. Really, the only people I think who are blameless in the situation are the employees of the banks whose deposits were held at Silicon Valley Bank. And that's, to me, the main argument you can make for taking such actions, is to protect all of them and their jobs so those companies could make payroll today. But I don't think the Biden bank bailout was necessary. There are a lot of other options.
I want to talk about those options. But Senator, I want to ask you this, though. There's a lot of questions about, look, there's been pushback on regulation for a very long time, especially among the GOP. You can look at Dodd-Frank even, and there are elements of Dodd-Frank that were rolled back under the Trump administration. Some have argued that even led to this as well. Where do you land on that idea? And while I completely agree with you that regulators should have caught this, there's also no question that there are people constantly pushing back on those regulators.
Well, Andrew, this is not really a failure of regulation. This is a failure of supervision, and it's a failure of these bank managers as well. Again, these are not esoteric, obscure questions of high finance. This is taking in demand deposits and high rates and putting it into long-held, low interest rate assets in a inflationary environment. Any responsible manager should have seen that was risky. They should have hedged that interest rate risk or taking other actions to protect themselves. But supervisors at places like the San Francisco Fed, failing the managers at the banks doing that, should have seen it themselves and demanded that they take those actions 6 months ago. This is a supervision problem, not a regulation problem.
Right. I don't know if you saw the Wall Street Journal. They had an op-ed where they suggested that one of the problems was they thought that SVB was too interested. Did you see this? Too interested in diversity and inclusion,
right?
And that what led to this was a sort of misfocus on wokeism. What do you think of that?
Well, I think the core failure, again, is the failure of the bank managers and the bank supervisors to see that they were taking in demand deposits at high rates and investing it in low interest rate assets in an inflationary environment. Now, I also suspect that given what this bank has been up to, just look at their website, just look at some of the events they've sponsored, that they probably were distracted somewhat by things like DEI and ESG investing and climate change. Likewise, you've got the Fed out there doing climate stress.
Maybe it was unfair of me to bring up the question. Do you really think that it was those issues that led to this? I mean, I can go back to the financial crisis of 2008, and you can look at the boards of those companies, and for the most part, they were white men across the board.
No,
and they still failed.
I don't think that's the primary cause. The primary cause, again, is the negligent and risky practices of the bank managers and the failure of Biden administration supervisors to take action against it.
But I am on the depositors, in the responsibility for depositors across the country at this point.
Well, so first, again, I want to go back to the depositors at Silicon Valley Bank, which are startups that sometimes had 8-figure, maybe even 9-figure balances in their deposits. The managers of those companies, again, were negligent in not doing better management of their own risks. Their employees, though, were the blameless ones. Again, there were plenty of ways to protect those employees. The FDIC was talking about doing an advanced dividend against receivership certificates. Most of these firms have private equity and venture capital backers who presumably could have fronted 30, 60, 90 days of payroll. Barring all that, there are investors out there willing to buy receivership certificates at anywhere from 80 to 90 cents on the dollar. So there are ways that all these firms could have remained a going concern, taken a haircut, but still made payroll today that didn't require the Biden bank bailout, which is going to have banks in Arkansas perhaps paying.
Wouldn't the conversation have changed if these weren't tech startups and these were retail shops on Main Street or farmers in the, Rust Belt? I mean, would this conversation be different in terms of what you call the Biden bank bailout?
Yeah, I think it would be very different. I think we all know that there's no chance Joe Biden would have bailed out a small bank in East Arkansas that was in a similar difficult position. Or maybe even more to the point, would Joe Biden have bailed out an equally large bank that was equally reckless in Midland, Texas, that almost exclusively banked the oil and gas industry? I think we all know there's no chance that Biden and the Democrats in charge would have bailed out those banks.
Senator, it is good to have you. That's a longer debate. I'd like to think that's not the case, and I'd like to think that the reason that SVB was bailed out was for the same reason, to prevent the dominoes from hitting Signature and then the rest of the industry. I hope that we have an opportunity to continue this conversation and have you back. We got some big numbers coming up, some data in just a moment, but thank you, Senator.
Thank you.